I specialize in sexual health education. I have a doctorate of public health, a master's of public health, and a bachelor's in psychology. I'm also a certified health education specialist and an ASEX certified sexuality educator. So I have over 20 years of experience of working with college age adults and older about sexual health education. And I've been teaching at the college level psychology of human sexuality for about 7 years now. And so, really, what I specialize in, kind of what I'm most proud of, is being able to translate research into practice. So, being able to boil down complicated public health psychological research into actionable information that people can use to improve their sexual health, to improve communication, to improve their relationships in real time. I think what would be interesting from a research perspective, but what is a huge bummer from an educator's perspective, is that I have been doing this for 20 years. And 18 to 25-year-olds still are coming to college and being allowed to enter into adulthood with no information. So you'd think in 20 years, and I've taught in New York, I've taught in Georgia, I've taught in Florida, and there is no difference in the amount of information they're getting regarding improving or taking ownership of their own sexual health in 20 years. So my curriculum has not had to change, even though the research has developed, has evolved. We're learning new things all the time. I'm still having to teach the basics. And this is from a perspective of my university that I teach now has a lot of non-traditional students. So I regularly have students who are 40 and up in my class, and they are also learning brand new information. So interesting that while research is moving us forward, education is holding everybody back because they're still not getting what they need to enter into adulthood, to take really like ownership and empowerment of who they are in order to celebrate their sexuality and enjoy it and feel pleasure. We're starting from square one for decades.
That is actually extremely interesting. And something you said that I think is really poignant is that even though research is growing and expanding, your curriculum, which you called the basics, is not changing because people still need that basic part to get started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Why do you think that is? Why are we still not teaching sexual literacy and sexual education in a proper and foundational way?
I think it goes back to how fast technology moves. And sexuality has always been a part of moving technology faster than people are prepared for. In fact, one of the most well-known parts about sexual consumerism is how porn selected VHS as the way that they were going to sell porn to consumers, which is why Betamax was phased out, simply because porn chose the other medium. Porn is also, easily accessible on the internet. And now you have social media where anybody can be an influencer and a content creator, do webcams and work for themselves, OnlyFans style. And when that section of culture moves so much faster than policy, than law, obviously education is one of the slowest moving sectors that we have in the US. You see a huge lag developing there. You also have people who teach it who age, right? They age out of using some of the technology. So if they don't know how to use social media, they don't know what OnlyFans is, they don't know, how webcam work, actually what it involves. You can't also have them educating people on how to use these technologies effectively or safely or in a healthy way. They just choose to omit that information, which means that everyone's getting that information online and not getting educated on whether or not it's credible information, whether or not it's something that's harmful or helpful to them. And that's something that I've seen. I've actually had to build in more lecture time to talking about body image and self-esteem because of the impact of social media and technology on how people feel about themselves, which is I would say not necessarily an area I focused on too much in sexual health to begin with. But I've had to go again back to the basics. Like these things should be taught to younger kids about body image and body positivity and self-esteem and how do you cultivate that. They're not learning that, and it's getting dragged down on social media. So I have to get them to a place to understand why that's important for them to then start making healthy sexual decisions that are pleasurable, that keep them safe. There's a lot to combat, right? When it comes to, you know, influencers who are sharing information like that's say not educationally correct and in many cases actually harmful. It just comes from at all angles, and I think educators have to be proactive. You have to be doing continuing ed, and you have to be on your game. You can't always use what worked before to educate people now. And I think while educators want to do the best that they can, you know, there is a reality to how much time you can dedicate to like learning the new social media fads and the new slang and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot working against it. And I also think politicians don't help. I think the more politicians take power into their own hands to really please a very few minority groups of people, the harder it is to do this work, to get the information to people before they are harmed, before they are abused, before they experience sex that isn't pleasurable. There's a lot to combat in this field, that's for sure.
I really love how you just broke that all down. I really do, because I think it can help people have a more holistic perspective of what's happening and the systems at play. It's actually part of the reason we even started this interview series was because we do see that there's a lot of misinformation out there. We believe that it's one of the biggest contributors to stigma. And obviously, being from a campsite, the models, the members, the platform itself faces a lot of that of stigma. So we wanted to kind of start an initiative. And there are a few that we've started where we're giving people like yourself a platform to speak and share more science-based and factual information around human sexuality as opposed to misconceptions. So just to kind of go back to the basics, so to speak, for anyone listening, what would you define as sexuality?
Sexuality is not an optional part of who we are. And I think that's where my public health background comes into play here. And it's actually very beneficial from a sexual health education perspective, because you said it, it's systems at play. And without understanding how systems affect who we are in all of the different aspects of emotional health, physical health, mental health, social health, environmental health, you can't really get to a problem because you're only looking at it from one lens. And it's really all the lens that contribute to how we're either able to access that part of who we are or we're not, right? All the barriers that get put up. Sexuality is inherent to who we are as human beings. We are born with inherent sexuality, just like we have personalities that are unique to ourselves, just like we have fingerprints that are unique to ourselves. And I think one of the things that people forget is that sexual health is not just about avoidance of illness and about making sure that like you're not getting a disease, you know, that you're protected at all times. Because that, again, is the messaging, if they get any, growing up about sexuality, is that it's something to kind of be fearful of, because if you engage in sex, you're going to get a disease or you're going to get pregnant or some terrible thing is going to happen. But the conversation very rarely revolves around sex is pleasurable. It is something that is the most ancient part of our brain. It's like eating, it's like breathing, it's like needing water. We don't think about it. Our bodies and our brains just need this in order to not just survive, but thrive in the world. Human touch is one of the most important things that we have evolved to need in order to improve our emotional well-being. So when people talk about sexuality and they neglect to talk about how important talking about pleasure is in that context, one, that message now becomes irrelevant for everybody who engages in sex, because most people engage in sex because it feels good. So now they're not even listening to you because they're like, well, I don't care because I'm going to do this anyways because it feels good. But then you also miss opportunities to tell people, you know what, you can still do these things and they can still feel really, really good, and keep yourself safe, and make really good connections with people that fulfill, you know, our social bonds that we need as human beings to feel connected to our networks. You can still do these things safely and enjoy yourself immensely. I think when I do that comparison of sexuality being like your personality, like it is just a part of who you are. I think that message is a lot easier for people to understand, because most of the time it boils down to, oh, well, my sexuality is just who I'm attracted to or who I'm not attracted to. Or the other definition people use is, what sexual behaviors do I engage in or do I not engage in? And sexuality is way more than just who you're attracted to and what kind of sex you like. And then people get more interested when they're like, oh, it's not just about that. Oh, okay. Um, you know, I make my students say this because, you know, it's hard to talk about sex without saying, you know, vulgar language. But I say, you know, our hypothalamus and our thalamus and our brain, like our lizard brain part of our brains, they really help control the four F's. And I make them say what the four F's. And the fourth one they don't ever want to say. And I'm like, you know it, it's fucking, or fornication if they don't want to say the F word, right? I'm like, but you can't control that need because that's where our brain is. It's centered in these drives. So, you know, I think that broader conversation about sexuality is something I try really hard to do with everybody that comes across my door, across my, you know, my computer, is talking about sexuality is not this, sexuality is this.
I really like how you tied the sexual part of our brains and compared it to the same part of our brains that eat and drink, because it gives a clear picture of, like you're saying, how primal and instinctual and part of us that part is, but we don't treat it that way. We fight for people's right to eat and drink water. We fight hard for that. Everyone deserves that. But it's true that we, for some reason, will not even look at sexuality in its wholeness, like you've said. We look at pieces that we're kind of comfortable with, but most of it we're not. And I think you used a really key word multiple times, which is pleasure, and the fact that our sexuality is tied to pleasure for us as human beings. So, my follow up question to you would be, why are we so uncomfortable with things that are tied to our pleasure?
Sure. I think we're very comfortable when we talk about men. That we live in a patriarchal society, right? Society and built to address, in particular, white male needs and wants and desires. In fact, all types of sexual consumerism has been built around attracting the time, attention, and money of white men. I think societally speaking, culturally speaking, we are dealing with decades of trying to control female sexuality. The idea that females want pleasure, that women also want it as much as, if not more than men, is deeply concerning for people who are entrenched in this idea, without sometimes even knowing that they hold these biases, right? A lot of people don't even question that, yeah, sex is for men, but not for women. They just think that way, right? It's certainly not a space that celebrates female pleasure, or female sexuality. In fact, it's controlled by procreation. Female sexuality is about birthing children. I think also historically, we've medicalized women's sexuality to be about childbirth, to be about controlling fertility, and not about how can you talk about your sexuality just like it's just a part of who you are. Um, I think we have plenty of models that show that other cultures, other countries do a really great job of balancing this idea of your culture needing family and stability as, you know, an institutional basis or foundation, and celebrating the individual, whether they're male or female, intersex, trans, that they deserve pleasure, that they deserve respect, and the ability to pursue the things that make them happy. I think there are models out there to show that it can be possible. I think when we don't examine how patriarchal our society has been, and how people are wrestling for that power back, that is part of one of the major reasons why we have a hard time talking about pleasure, because it's not just for men. But that's the only way we've seen it. That's the only way it's really been acceptable in our society. I talk about famous sexual health researchers in my class, and Kinsey, who everyone knows, there's a movie about him, right? Like, so, everyone knows about Alfred Kinsey. His sexual behavior in the Human Male book made him famous. The same data set that he used for the book, he wrote another book, Human Sexuality, or Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and it got him blacklisted from the scientific community. It's the same data. This is the same data set. He just wrote a separate book. And that was it. That's not scientific. We can't hear that as a society, that women want sex as much, that they have just as much premarital sex as men do, that they, aren't all super straight. So I think that has a lot to do with why, as a society, we struggle with talking about pleasure, because inevitably women want to talk about it. And that can be really hard in a society that doesn't let women kind of own that.
It's interesting because the Kinsey Institute has done a lot of research on LiveJasmin's user base and the models specifically, which we'll touch on further into the interview. But I did not know that Kinsey had been blacklisted for a book about women's sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, he was selling out lecture halls. He was giving lectures to tens of thousands of people about his sexual behavior in the Human Male book. And it was the data collected at the same time, but it was about the female cohort of that data set, and people were very unhappy with him. And he had a really hard time kind of getting his research out there after that, simply because of the data set around women's sexual behavior.
With all of that in mind, what you just said about society's discomfort around female pleasure specifically, if you could give one message to everyone in the world about human sexuality that you don't think they're getting, or maybe just not looking at, what would that message be?
We have a system that is so uneven in who gets comprehensive sex ed, who gets to enter into puberty with having information that equips them to go through puberty without as much psychological harm as it can cause. We have people who are entrenched in religious doctrine where that information is withheld, and in fact puts them at risk of experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of the people who have the power in that system, a hierarchical power system. So it's hard to say that everyone needs the same message, because everyone does not start from the same place. And the public health person in me is like, the systems, when they're unequal to begin with, you end up with health inequities out the wazoo, and it causes a lot of harm to the system because the individual is harmed, which means the family is harmed, which means generations of family are harmed, right? These things take a generational toll. I think I would go back to this idea that sexuality is not optional. It is a part of who we are that needs to be honored, just like every other part of who we are. Just like we pay attention to our heart health by doing cardio, we understand that strength training is really important for longevity. We are now starting to get the idea that mental health is really important, and that physical health affects the mental and mental affects the physical. I mean, obviously, those of us who've worked in this field forever, it's not new information. But for some people, lately, it's been brand new, right? Just like, we're learning that loneliness is now the new public health epidemic, and it's causing people to have shorter lifespans. That social health aspect is important. Sexual health, sexuality is just as important. I also kind of describe it as it doesn't exist in a vacuum from the other sections of your life. And a lot of times people treat sexuality like it is something that I can just make decisions here and it'll never affect anything over here. Just the idea of having to withhold your sexual orientation from your loved ones, and kind of being on the DL and going on dating apps and, having anonymous sex with people simply because that's all you can access, to really honor that part of who you are, but you're keeping it a secret from everybody else. We know now is psychologically damaging. It is very difficult for people to live whole lives, and be fully functioning adults when they are treating parts of their life as sectional, as separate from the rest of who they are. So that's what I also say too, is that sexuality doesn't exist in a vacuum. The decisions you make in your sexual life affect the rest of your life as well. And not just in negative ways, they can affect them in really positive ways, right? When you have a great positive support system, if you're a sex worker and you are surrounded by religious doctrine that says that you're going to hell, obviously it's going to take a huge toll. But if you're surrounded by people who are sex positive, who don't judge you, regardless of whether they work in the industry or not, you're going to have better outcomes. And you're probably going to be more likely to take better care of yourself because you're surrounded by a social network that supports you. So again, it's not a separate part of who you are that doesn't affect the other parts of how you exist and move through this world. And I think the earlier that message gets to people, the better. But yeah, that's a big question. Like, what's one message? Like, obviously sexuality should be celebrated. Like, I wish everybody would think that, but I mean, so many people just don't even start with understanding that they have inherent sexuality, let alone that that's something to be celebrated.
I think it's fair to start where you did, which is that you can't separate your sexuality from yourself. It is intrinsically part of who you are. And to touch on something else you said about the messaging that people may have received and then be put in a situation and what that can do to them, I interviewed someone who was raised in a very religious background, and the messaging around sex was, it's very bad, it's very sinful, you can only do it if you're married, and that's it. And this person actually did completely wait until she was married to have sex. However, even though she was doing it in the confines of what she had been taught in her religion is acceptable, because there was so much messaging around sex is bad, unless, it was very hard for her. And she actually struggled with her husband for a while to even feel good about having sex with him because that messaging was still part of her, you know?
Sure.
How do you undo something that's done at a young age? Does it just go away? We teach abstinence only, basically. But then when it is time to have sex, which is part of who we are, it's a real basic drive and need to some degree. Where do those messages go? Do they just disappear? We know that they don't, you know?
Right, right. And religious trauma is a real thing. We are understanding more and more that religious trauma is just as damaging as physical abuse for young people. This idea that older people are passing down absolutes, right? There's no room for in between. In particular, when young people don't understand why there's not an in between, why are these are absolutes? And then when they hit puberty, right, and the influx of hormones, their body changes, it becomes even more confusing. Like, I'm having these feelings and these thoughts, and they're natural. Like, I'm not trying to think about sex. I'm not trying to be attracted to somebody. I just am. You're telling me that this is all wrong, even though I'm not doing anything, right? I'm not even acting on them, but you're telling me that the person that I am is wrong. The reason why that's also so confusing is that they're also taught that we're made in the image of God, but we're already wrong. So how do you combat those two very opposing ideas? You can't. This idea of cognitive dissonance doesn't work when you're talking about two opposing ideas that we're made in the image of God, but yet you're already born wrong. And everything that you're doing, you need to be actively working against the natural parts of who you are, the way God created you. It's a very, very damaging psyche to be steeped in. And in fact, it's even harder when you're only surrounded, right? Like you're going to these schools or you're being homeschooled, you're not being exposed to any other ways of thinking or ways of life or people who may look differently than you. Exposure to everybody else is what tends to work in the favor of people letting go of some of these messages. I think that's why college and moving away, whatever that looks like, is so important for people and their ability to emotionally mature, is because you naturally become surrounded by people who you weren't surrounded before at all. Whether they're a different race, they're a different ethnicity, whether it's rural or urban, you become exposed to things that you weren't exposed to before, and that makes you question your influences. And I think many people go through that kind of young adulthood and they're like, are these things that I want to hold on to? Are these not things? And many times we do hold on to those things. You're like, you know what? This messaging works for me. I enjoy the fact that I saved myself from my marriage. I enjoy that I've only had one sexual partner. Like, I appreciate that about my messaging, and I'm happy with who I am. And other people aren't happy with that. They don't understand why they were forced to wait. They have a miserable experience with their one and only partner because they weren't taught how to communicate about sex, or how to ask for what they want during sex from their own married spouse. But I think everyone needs to go through that experience of, I'm being exposed to differences, and then I can choose what were those messages I grew up with that either work for my adulthood or don't work for my adulthood. I think the people who don't have that exposure struggle because they never got that choice of, does this work for me anymore? Is this anything that ever worked for me? Which I think everyone should have the right to do, to become the person that they want to be.
Really quickly to your point about, did you call it religious trauma or?
Yes, religious trauma. Yes.
Religious trauma. It's really interesting that point you brought up about many religions teach you're made in the image of God, but you're extremely sinful and most things about you are not good. You know what I mean? Like, and while I appreciate the sentiment, and I actually grew up in a religion that taught something very similar, just like from a psychological perspective, like you said, there's something about it that can't be rectified in someone's consciousness. So even though you're trying to maybe put someone on the right path, there's still, we have, a system and brains and how things work, and they get affected. And just one personal example is, I remember I grew up in a very particular Christian sect, and it taught very much that, like, we're not even worth God's love, and Jesus died on the cross for our sinful self. And I remember when I was a teenager, I made like a Zynga site, which is this old social media.
I remember. Yep.
Bring it back. But I made a Zynga site, and my username was something like not even close to worthy. And I was talking about God's love. But as an adult woman now who's had to really like do work on myself, when I look back on the teenage version of me who actually did have self-esteem issues, I feel like there is a correlation of, not even close to worthy. I'm so sinful that God had to die on the cross. And even that is like, and I still don't deserve it. When you have that programming in at a young enough age, that is your programming, that you're just not enough or good enough. And I can say that that is truly something that I can identify as something I had to work on just for my own self-esteem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think religious doctrine, when it doesn't take into account cultural change, the needs of young people as we understand it from research, we still treat religion like it has to be exactly the same no matter what era we're in. And I think a lot of people love that about religion because it is the standard, it is steady, it's not changing. But like with all things with culture and society, it must adapt, it must um, change to be relevant and to continue to preach the idea that community is important, right? I think a lot of people go to religion because community is important. They want a support system. But when you're actively fighting against creating a community of love and support because everyone in it feels wrong, feels sinful, feels, like you said, unworthy, then you're asking a whole bunch of people to contribute to a community of care where everyone feels like shit about themselves. So if you feel like shit about yourself, why would you go to bat for your neighbor then? You don't think that you're worthy of your neighbor going to bat for you. Um, and the idea also that, sex is something that is so shameful. When sexual abuse does happen, when sexual trauma does happen, it ends up working against the person who's been victimized. They either can't report it to the adults in their life, or they're blamed for the fact that they were sexually abused or assaulted. Um, and it just kind of keeps going, right? The generational issues around sex and tying it with your religion, and is this who you want to be, becomes a major factor in why people have you know generations of religious trauma. I think in particular, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and I remember from the get-go, I mean, I think a lot of us, that's why we're in sexology to begin with, is just we were always a little different when we were little. um, I reveled in it. When I would go to Sunday school, I would be like, well, why can't we plan our children? Because they were like, that's not what God wants. And I was like, but God made me like this, and I don't want children. So why would I want to just keep having children? And I was 5 at the time, and I remember saying this in Sunday school. I got in a lot of trouble. And I was like, but if there's birth control, like, why can't we use it? Like, if God made man, and man, it created science to understand the world God was in, and man created birth control. Again, what, like, why wouldn't God want me to use that? And oh, I was in a lot of trouble all the time. But it's this idea, right, that like I wasn't willing to accept those messages because they didn't make logical sense to me. And I was supported in that by my parents. And my parents also, as they were both physicians, they were very science oriented, even though as immigrants they were very Catholic. They also probably struggled a lot with like merging the science with the Catholicism. And when they saw that I was like that, they're like, well, I mean, we raised her, but what, how else was she going to be? So I don't think it was a shock that I entered into this field of trying to understand sex from a scientific and research perspective. But I mean, that's I encourage people to explore. I encourage people to get out there, whatever it looks like, without stigma, without judgment, because that's the only way that you can move past things that most people have felt have held them back in some way from developing into the person that they want to be.
It's interesting because even I would say a large percentage of the user base and member base of LiveJasmin, they're essentially using the platform as a way to explore themselves sexually and to know themselves. Many of them have this fantasy that they have never felt comfortable sharing with a partner or have been rejected around. And so they haven't really been able to explore that part of themselves. And so they come to LiveJasmin and they're able to act out that fantasy and see if they even like it, because sometimes they say, I did that and I actually don't want to do it again. But there was a curiosity, and it's a safe place to act that out. But when I think about it, how many places do we have in society where we can explore our sexuality, or at the very least just talk about sex? Like, what does it mean, sexuality, any of it, fantasies? There aren't a lot of acceptable places to have this conversation.
People who have physical space from the physical act of sex. So they're sexting, they are, cyber sex, they're doing webcam work, where the risk of physical harm is nil because they can't literally physically interact with this person. That then becomes a safe space for them to start doing these things, to say, do I want to talk like this? Do I like my body enough to put it on camera? Do I get the power to say, no, I'm not going to do that on camera, or I'm not going to send you this photo? I want to try this fantasy, like you said, and be like, nope, one and done. I don't need to do that again. Or like, hell yeah, that I'm going to do that every day. That becomes the thing that's the real positive in this space. All of us who get involved in sexuality, whether it's selling sex, buying sex, teaching about sex, researching it, we love sex. Like it is such a big part of who we are, but it's not the only part of who we are, right? And I think the more that people who have the ability to advocate for sex workers, in particular, like respected professionals and fields of science, to say, you know what, this isn't all harmful. There's ways that we can empower and protect these people so that they can do what they want to do and be celebrated and advocated for. I think what we're existing in now is a very different space for sex workers online than 10 years ago, right? And I think social media obviously has a lot to do with that. But, you know, that voice needs to keep being said, that sex work is important. It's not say necessary, but it has always existed, which means that some people find it necessary to access sex work, right? Not everyone's going to have the ability to have physical sexual interaction in person with somebody else. And this is going to be the space that they're going to want it and need it and use it. So how do we make it safe? How do we make it financially viable? How do we make it so that people don't take advantage and abuse the system? I think we're seeing more voices in the space to say this is a worthy area of employment. Not everyone needs to do this and not everyone needs to be buying it. But it's just like any other field of employment, it needs to be protected and it needs to have people advocating to say if these people are willing to do this and want to do this and are autonomously doing this, right? Not being forced into it, obviously, because the sex trafficking is a whole different conversation. Then how do we make sure that they can do the work that they want to do and be protected and get paid for it?
Absolutely. And that's definitely our position too, is that we don't want the industry underground. That's part of why we're elevating it up top, because it's when things are pushed underground that they do become way more dangerous because we can't see what's happening. So it's actually in everyone's best interest to have this here on land. And if you want to develop regulation systems or whatever the case is, at least that's what's really keeping people safe and everything, like you said, in the open and seen. So that's definitely a really important point. And to your point as well, I've also interviewed members who have disabilities and they're not as mobile to just leave their home, you know, and so they don't have access to, you know, a diverse social life per se. And yet they still have intimacy needs. But what is interesting, and I'm really curious about your thoughts on this, is the Kinsey Institute. They've done a lot of research on LiveJasmin, and they found that the models who were in the longest calls and generating the most income were not really talking about anything explicit. They were talking about day-to-day activities. What did you have for dinner? Do you want to watch a movie together? What happened at work? It was like a real connection that the member had developed with the model and would stay on for hours and hours. I've heard stories of a member saying, okay, I'm going to take you private for 10 hours and just live your life, like do what you would do. Because that member just wants to feel like they're living life with someone, like you would if you had someone in your space and you were like, okay, I'm washing the dishes, I'm taking calls, and that's all they want. So that is a clear indication that many members, especially for a campsite where you're paying by the minute, this isn't just free sex like porn can be online. they're definitely there because this is much more connection based and that's meeting a need that they have. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I'm not shocked by it. And I think a lot of people who are in the sex work industry talk about a lot of their regular clients are not people that are actually engaging in sexual activity or wanting that with them. That is a very, very common occurrence. So I'm not surprised by it. I think that goes 100% hand in hand with our loneliness epidemic. I think that goes hand in hand with people who potentially have been the information about sexual orientation and sexual desire that being withheld from them as an educational point. That some people are asexual and don't necessarily crave sexual interaction with people. Um, that some people have lower libidos and some people have higher libidos, right? That is just a natural state of being. Um, I am not surprised at all that people would want to just pay for minutes to talk with people. I think there's also a safety in that we understand very clear boundaries on what this relationship is, which is really hard to do in person because you're actually like dealing with someone that is kind of rogue. Like you don't know how they're going to accept your boundary, and maybe you don't even know how to explain your boundaries. Paying for minute by minute interaction is a very clear, understandable boundary. And when people have boundaries, they know how to behave, and the rules become clear, the expectations become clear. So people can thrive in that environment and be themselves. There's a reason why I also have a full lecture about communication relationships that is separate from sex, just talking about communications and communicational methods and styles, because that is the conversation that's hard to develop with someone that you're dating or someone you've met online. How do we establish clear-cut boundaries so that we know the rules of engagement and can develop something from here? That's not taught. People just like assume that they'll learn how to do this on their own, and they don't, and they fail at that, and they have hard relationships. And I kind of love that is a space where people are like, there is safety here. I know how this relationship works. And if I'm willing to pay for it, then I'm willing to pay for it. Like, who says what I can do with my money? Like, I can do whatever I want with my own money. And the fact that sex is not even a part of that, I think is just so part of how we interact with people online nowadays. Like, we just want a connection.
And it's an instant connection. I interviewed a member who suffered a severe heart attack, and one of the side effects of his heart attack is that he has really bad anxiety now, and he'll get anxiety and panic attacks. And he said that, because he has a few models in particular that he likes spending time with, but he said just knowing that when he's feeling anxious, he can talk to anyone instantly. Like there is someone available is comforting to his mind to just know he can log on and yep, someone's going to talk to him,
Yeah, because mental health doesn't always work that way. I mean, you can't just access your psychologist or your therapist when you're in the moment. Having this kind of space to do that, even though it's not mental health help, it's a space that makes your mental health feel better. Absolutely. Right. I can see why people would be all about that.
And there are certain elements of therapy that happen in this space, which is a listening ear. But, you touched on a really interesting phenomena earlier, which I also have really appreciated about cam sites, particularly this idea that the relationship is defined clearly. And so you'd actually have to work hard to misunderstand the dynamic. You really would. Because you are paying for an interaction, the rules. And in our modern connection age, we don't have that clarity. And that's very clear in this hookup culture. I have a girlfriend right now who has been leaning on me because she met someone and had sex with him because she really liked him like right away. And he's now completely pulled away. And that's hurtful for her. I think for her, she saw that this might be a committed relationship, and that's why she was willing to engage. I think for him, I don't know that he ever saw or considered that, but they never had a discussion about what where is this going for you? What are you looking for? What are you not looking for? And maybe if he had said, well, I'm not really looking for much right now, and then she knew, okay, well, this isn't someone who's going to give me a relationship, maybe she would have chosen differently, as opposed to just assuming that connection equals commitment, because it doesn't. That really has to be communicated.
Yeah. Yeah. I have this exercise where I work with people on language, and especially younger people who spend a lot of time communicating online or not in like face-to-face interactions, texting, that kind of thing. And I ask them to everybody define for me what hooking up means. What does we're talking mean? What does we're together mean? These are all words that everyone throws around all the time to describe their status or their relationship without ever questioning what are those behaviors that are included in that language. Half people say hooking up means penetrative sex. The other, quarter says it just means making out. The other quarter says it includes everything but penetrative sex. And I'm like, so you're now starting to talk to someone who has a different definition of hooking up than you do. And nobody has actually stopped to say, what sexual behaviors are we agreeing to when we say that we're hooking up? And I was like, it sounds clinical. It sounds like a silly conversation, but it is as clear as what kinds of things do you do when you hook up with other people? Because this is what I do when I hook up with other people. Are we on the same page? It doesn't have to be like we write a list, you write a list, and are we matching or not? But these are conversations that people literally don't even think about having. When I ask, what does commitment mean? The definition of commitment, most people say, is when you're committed to each other. And I'm like, you can't use the word in the definition, right? That's basics. And they have no idea how they would define commitment. I'm like, so commitment is one of those other nebulous words that does it mean something different for other people? Yes. And if you haven't had that discussion, that's what makes in-person relationships very challenging, because you are pushed to over communicate in a way that you have not even been taught to basically communicate, let alone go above and beyond to say, these are the things I'm absolutely not going to stand for. These are things I will. And unfortunately, we have a society that encourages people to learn through trial and error, especially when it comes to sex. Well, you'll learn once you get chlamydia. That's not something that you want. You'll learn when you have an unplanned pregnancy how to get an abortion, or you won't. And there's no reason that we have to set people up like that. We can tell people this is how you clearly communicate your sexual wants and desires before you enter into any scenario that could cause you emotional or physical harm. You can have those conversations. Here's how to do it easily. Webcamming and online interactions, it's like already there, right? And even the fact that you're like, I decide when this interaction ends, like the minute it ends, I am done. Like I can decide that. You can't do that with someone in person. Like, I mean, you can, but you'd be kind of a big asshole. Like, I'm done with this interaction.
Goodbye.
Like, bye, I'm done. Not really the greatest tactic in person, but online, that is how that works. And that's very comforting because it's so clear and drawn, like hard lines drawn down.
And furthermore, what's interesting is that in order to get what you want in this online camming experience, you have to be very clear about what your need is in the interaction. I really want to try out my fantasy that is X, Y, and Z. And then the model will be like, well, I can give you X and Y, but I don't do Z. And then you agree. It's so clear, that communication, in order for you to get your money's worth, so to speak, which is your goal in many cases. And so that is even further, even though it's like very clear what the interaction is, even more than that, they do get extremely clear with what they're looking for, what they're willing to do, and what they're not. And I've always wondered, because I've interviewed members who have seen the same model for 15 years, and it truly is a friendship now. I mean, these members have moved, they're engaged, they have their lives, but they still want to chat with this particular model. And so I was wondering, like, what? And this happens a lot where I interview members that have these long-term relationships. And I myself was wondering, like, what is it about this dynamic that can form a bond that is lasting 15 years and they've never met in person? And I think my hypothesis is that when you do have such clear and explicit conversation with people about things that are so close to your heart, like your sexuality or your fantasies that are very vulnerable topics, it does forge a very strong bond because you're not like, we don't have very many people, unfortunately, because we haven't been taught, where we're so clear and so explicit with our needs, wants, and desires with in our lives that when we do encounter that, it's like, boom, that person is locked in.
Mhm.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
Accepting people where they are and who they are in the moment is the biggest contributor to psychological safety. And I think that is what is a part of those interactions, is saying, I'm not judging you for asking this of me. In fact, this is the whole point of this interaction, is you're paying me to give you this experience. That's why it's clear. That's why it's as open as it is. And being able to show that to someone, I'm not judging you. I'm not saying this is disgusting. I'm not saying you're a horrible person for wanting me to do this. Even in those times where the model doesn't want to do that activity, they're not saying you're nasty. How dare you? Saying I don't do that, right? I don't do that, and there's other people on here that will do that, and you're free to go find them. Um, that piece of accepting people where they are, who they are, with no judgment is, I think, the only thing that will allow people to get to a safe space in their sexuality. There is no in between. You have to accept people for who they are. You have to accept them where they're at and be non-judgmental about it. And then they have the opportunity to thrive. They get to be themselves. They get to have psychological safety in that relationship, in that space. And who doesn't have psychological safety with someone that they are sexually engaged with, right? Like, that's the only way you actually have super pleasurable sex, is 100% psychological safety with this person. That's a beautiful thing to be able to offer a service that allows for that. And it's like built into the system because you have to be so clear with your boundaries and expectations and your wants and needs.
I love what you just said because it so clearly defines what psychological safety is. So, to your point further, think about it. Even in marriages, I've interviewed so many therapists at this point and counselors and psychologists who have said, I sit down with couples, and these couples, they have sex, but they don't talk about sex. They don't really talk about their needs, wants, and desires for whatever reason, usually some type of fear of judgment, fear of not being accepted, or fear because they haven't been accepted with this person in this place before. And so, psychological safety, when you really think about it, how many places do we truly feel psychologically safe, even if it's with people we live with, or family, or friends? We may have been judged by them already. So we know, like, we can't fully be ourselves with them. We don't fully feel accepted. So, yeah, now I'm seeing this psychological safety as like a diamond. It's like the more rare it is, the more valuable it is to you. And I can see why sometimes, members of Jasmine that have found that acceptance there, they're willing to choose that over other things, other relationships sometimes, because again, they have found this feeling of acceptance.
It's what I want for everyone, right? This idea about you have to psychologically feel safe yourself, which means you have to ask for those things that make you psychologically safe. But then you also have to be with someone who's willing to do that, or people who are willing to do that, which is why we find our communities, right? Why LGBTQIA spaces exist, because there's psychological safety there. Why sex worker spaces exist, because there's psychological safety there. They are crucial to making sure that people can be their authentic selves wherever they are. And usually people who are their authentic selves don't give a shit about what anybody else is doing because it doesn't bother them. It's people who are like, I don't feel psychologically safe. I feel unaccepted or unloved, or there's something about me that I need to be ashamed about, that I'm now going to hyper focus on that on somebody else because it takes the spotlight away from me. People who are really like centered and love themselves are not bothered by what anybody else is doing. They're just not. I mean, that's one of the beauties of psychological safety is like, I'm good. I want this for you. I don't want you to suffer. So I don't want to be the person who makes you suffer. I'm great. I want you to be great with me. It's the people who are like, I'm not doing well. I want other people to not be doing well either. That causes them to go after sex workers, that causes them to go after people who purchase sex. Especially, when it's in a consenting adult space. That is the thing that I get frustrated. Like, these are consenting adults. I fight for that to be the experience people have with me when I'm educating, is that there is psychological safety with me. There's literally nothing you can say to me that will shock me. I have been doing this for 20 years. I literally have heard everything when it comes to sexual behaviors, desires, wants, engagement, all of it. I think people have tried to shock me when they see my face literally doesn't change. They're like, oh, okay. And then they start asking the hard questions. They start asking the questions that they've never been able to ask anybody else in their whole lives, knowing that I will be the person who just gives them the facts, no judgment. And that's hard for me to be 40. And I'm still, for many people, the first and only person that's given them that in their whole lives. That's a bummer. That's a bummer. There should be more spaces. There should be more people.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, as we know and we've discussed, connection is a primal need. Our sexuality is part of who we are. If we're not fully tapped into our sexuality, are we even able to fully connect? Are we ever having that need truly met?
I mean, the short answer is no, right? Sexuality is as simple as human touch, as simple as psychological safety, right? These things I've been saying a lot. When you are out of touch with who you are and what you want, the simple act of holding hands or hugging someone feels uncomfortable, even though we are born into the world needing human touch. We have our brains are literally want us to belong. We want to understand how things are categorized in the world. We want to label them for safety reasons, right? We want to avoid the things that cause us harm. But it's a part of belongingness, of being a part of a group, of a network, that calms our brains down, that lets us relax when we understand how things are and where they belong. That includes us too. I think, like I said, sexuality is not optional. Like, this feeds directly, all the decisions we make or don't make about our sexuality directly affect all other aspects of who we are. But because people clinicalize sexuality, they medicalize sexuality, it becomes easy to ignore it. Like, well, I'm not having sex, so I don't need to go get a pap smear. But that's not what it is. Like, that's not the only thing you need to be paying attention to. You don't need to only be thinking about these clinical medical aspects of sexual health and sexuality, because you miss all that other part that is crucial to our psychology, to our emotional well-being, of just being human beings existing in the world. We need to connect. We need to touch. We need to honor those parts of ourselves to literally feel emotionally balanced. Yeah.
I have a question. This just came to me. I'm curious, is there anything that has to do with our pleasure? Anything, even enjoying your favorite flavor ice cream, that is not under the umbrella of our sexuality? Is pleasure intrinsically tied to sexuality?
I mean, the way I teach it, yes. I think, if I were an MD, I might have had different training and understanding of the parts of sexuality I need to pay attention to. And that's fair, right? That's their training and discipline. I think because so many people operate from a perspective of this feels good to me and that's why I do it, you can't separate sexuality from pleasure, right? Just even the idea of human touch. Human touch, hugging, holding hands, being back to back with someone, just your skin touching someone else releases hormones that you don't control. It just happens. I mean, your body is literally primed to do this on its own. And that's how we bond with people, is through the release of those hormones. So at a biological level, at a cellular level, yes, pleasure is completely intrinsically tied to sexuality, because you can't even divorce how your body reacts to it. It just happens on its own. To say this creates the bond, me saying, I'm touching you, here's some oxytocin, here's some vasopressin, here are all the feel good hormones that bond you to this person. We just do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh my goodness, that's so true. And, you know, just little things like if someone eats an ice cream that they love so much, sometimes they'll be like, you know, they make these noises that can sound sexual. Or sometimes people will, things that you wouldn't even think are sexual, but that's so pleasurable for them, like a super organized home. And people will say, this turns me on, or this
Mm-hmm.
makes me horny, you know, because probably there's so much pleasure in that thing that there's some truth to that. There is some release somewhere that makes them stimulate something that's kind of sexual, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, if you think on the flip side, all those kind of scenarios reduces someone's anxiety. I mean, your anxiety is real high. You can't access your pleasure. So a clean house gets your anxiety down, which means now your ability to experience pleasure can now skyrocket. I mean, it's not even on that kind of level where it's not necessarily that, like, like my blood now is flowing to my vulva because you put the dishes away. But like now I don't have to think about that, which means I can think about the things that give me pleasure in life, which is having sex, which is masturbating, which is whatever, right? So yeah, even on that level of just like reducing anxiety and reducing mental load, that's important, which gives you more space for pleasure and experiencing it.
Absolutely. And to your point, you know, I have girlfriends who are married, and some of them say, you know, my husband doesn't help out at all. So I'm working full time and I'm cleaning the house and taking care of the kids, and I can't have sex with him. Like they're just not turned on. They can't. They're too tired. And everything in their eyes that he's doing is so displeasing to them, not pleasurable, that they're not turned on. Whereas I have other girlfriends that are like, yeah, my husband's the best. He hired us a chef. I don't have to cook anymore, and has been relieving some of their load or their burden. And they're very turned on by their husband, you know, and because whatever he's doing in the way that they're perceiving it is so pleasurable, and it does make them want to have more or less actual sex.
Yeah. And we know that that serotonin and dopamine loop are important for being able to experience sexual arousal. So when you're highly anxious, it's that same type of experience of your receptors are now working in a different way that inhibits your ability to become sexually aroused. I mean, neurologically speaking, this happens. That's why mental load is not this like made up phenomenon for, in particular, women. Women are the ones that experience it the most because of the domestic load, the domestic chores. But our brains, our bodies are literally like screaming at us. We want to feel good. And when you make us not feel good, whether it's on purpose, it's unintentional because you have too much on your plate, it is too hard for us to feel good. And all we want to do is get back to that place of things feeling good, and that's why we do them. I mean, you look at children and that's all they do. They just do things that feel good, right? Like there is no like, messaging or weird things, or they don't have stress from doing laundry and like they're just like, this felt good. That's why I did it.
Yeah, I
Oh,
colored on the wall because it felt good to me.
it felt good. I wanted to, and I did it, right? And there's this, innocence and naivety about it, but that's what their brains are doing and telling them to do. And that happens for all of us, but life gets in the way, maturity gets in the way, responsibilities get in the way, and communicating is a way to get that feedback loop back under control. Um, you know, being non-judgmental, giving psychological safety, giving opportunities to build your self-esteem, get that feedback loop back under control so that you can be aroused, so you can get pleasure and want it. And that's why like all of that is so, I mean, it's a part of who we are.
Absolutely. And it's so true because even in my own life, Whenever I feel like something is very clear between me and a boss, me and a friend, me and a partner, I feel so much relief in that. When I feel
Mhm.
like there's ambiguity, I actually feel very stressed. There's like this
Yes.
tension that develops. And so it's really true now that you kind of bring it to light in a conscious way that the more we very clearly communicate, then the less there is room for disappointment because either someone's going to say, no, that's actually not possible. And then you know right away, as opposed to finding out down the line. Or now they know that that's an expectation of yours and they figure out how to meet it or not, or whatever the case is. But yeah, just having very clear communication is so foundational, just even for peace of mind, because then you know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, really. And I hope there's more talks in the future. We definitely have stuff coming up for that. But my final question for you, simply for the sake of time, is from your experience and your perspective, what are some of the foundational next steps in creating a more sexually positive, sexually well society?
Mhm. I think we need to start with teaching children about the importance of self esteem and positive body image that sets them up for interactions with other people. The next piece of that is, I mean, and that's really what comprehensive sex ed is. It's starting those conversations very young. It's not about teaching them how to have sex. It's saying, you know, if you need to build self esteem, you need to learn how to control who touches your body and who doesn't. You need to know what is healthy for your body to function, not necessarily looks or being skinny, but loving your body for what it can do, which sets you up for future interactions with other people. Um, Communicating, we've been talking about it the whole time. I think that's just one of the most crucial skills that we just completely overlook as being not something we need to teach, like we teach math or we teach science. Communication needs to be part of how people are being educated in this country. And obviously, I think that would solve a whole host of issues. Um, but I think, you know, teaching people psychological safety from a perspective of how do you accept yourself so that you can accept other people, I think are like foundational things that need to be taught sooner. Um, because by the time someone gets to a space where they can now consent and learn this information on their own, they're adults, quote unquote, legally speaking. Many times it's too late. They've already made life altering sexual decisions. Some of them can be extremely damaging to their mental health and their longevity. And other people are just wallowing. They don't know what to do with their sex. They don't know what to do with partners. They're being hurt left and right because they don't know, you know, what commitment means, and or they're never learning how to actually connect with someone, which is just as damaging as not being able to connect with someone. Um, I think all those foundational pieces, the earlier we teach them, and really they're not about sex. They're like crucial life skills that make you an emotionally intelligent adult, then translate into giving you a better sex life, getting you more in touch with your sexuality, because it is a natural next step. If you accept who you are, well, then, and you love your body, well, then you're not going to let someone tell you that your body isn't attractive. You're going to actually enjoy sex more because you're not thinking about how your body looks in this light or unclothed. You're going to communicate, yes, I will do that activity or I won't do that activity. And if that person doesn't accept it, you move on to somebody else. They're all connected and they need to be taught a lot sooner.
Amen. I could not agree more. And to your point, when you were talking about communication needs to be taught with math, with science, when I think about the math that I learned in high school, geometry, I don't use that. I, what? I
Right.
don't use geometry at all. Now, I appreciate and understand that some professions do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that may be a foundation for them. But no matter what your profession is in life, if you have a profession in life, you always need to use communication. You will always have, that is so foundational to being a human being and interacting and navigating this world. It is mind boggling to me that we are not, like you said, with math, with science, and all these things that actually, for most people, go completely unused later in life. It's mind boggling that we're not teaching interpersonal skills.
Right.
And not every child obviously has a family that is jumping in and putting them in social situations or teaching them those skills. These are things that need to be taught in school. I
Many
completely
times their parents don't have those skills at all. And it just continues the cycle of not being able to communicate effectively with people that you love or care about.
100%. This has been a wonderful interview. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Really.
Same.
I so appreciate your time. Yes.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed this, and I hope to be a part of these in the future. I would love to help out in any way I can. But yeah, this has been really nice. Thank you for the time.
Absolutely. Thank you.